This is what we call the political spectrum, and what it does is it helps us to label and categorize various political groups and leanings here in the United States, but also throughout the world and throughout history. Some of these things should look familiar to you because we covered them in the French Revolution and the political revolutions of the Americas back in world history. But basically there are five major groups that we're going to look at on the spectrum, and what we'll do is we'll just start from left to right. Again, we're talking about politics now, so if somebody is on the far left of this imaginary line, say a line runs from left to right here at the top, if you were to call yourself a far leftist or a radical, you would advocate for immediate change or reform to economic and or social issues. Your views would be very extreme, and very extreme, sometimes to the point where you would use either violent or non-violent types of strategies to adopt these types of changes. Some of these groups can be terrorists. A lot of fringe political parties also. Radicals might be categorized sometimes as those who might partake in outings for PETA or for Greenpeace or things like that. Anarchists are also on the far left. The majority of Americans, the majority of people all over are not in this category in the far left, and they're definitely not in the category in the far right either. So what we're going to find is that most people, Americans and everybody, are going to fall somewhere in the range of liberals, moderates, and conservatives. Don't worry about the type of car. We'll talk about what that means in class, so I'll know if you watch this. Liberals are those on the left. They advocate for gradual change in economic and social issues. They are usually Democrats, so some of the Democrats from Minnesota that would identify themselves as liberal would be our two senators, Amy Klobuchar and Al Franken. Tim Walz is a representative from Minnesota who is a liberal, as is Keith Ellison and Betty McCollum. They are all liberals. The representative from District 2, the district that we live in, is John Klein, and he's a conservative. We'll talk about him in a little bit. But usually liberals are more in favor of gradual change and are Democrats. The majority of people, however, are in this category right down the middle. They are known as moderates or centrists, meaning that their political views tend to fall left and right depending on the issue, usually economic and social. They advocate for things like compromise. They are moderates from the Republican Party and the Democratic Party and also other third parties. An example of a moderate, a modern-day moderate, would be Tom Horner, who ran for governor a couple of years ago and ended up losing that election. But basically, moderates are those that will take ideas from the left and the right and work towards compromise, and this is where the majority of people tend to place themselves on the political spectrum. Conservatives are those that are oftentimes Republicans. They're on the right side of the political spectrum. They like to maintain the status quo. You'd hear a lot of if it ain't broke, don't fix it type quotes from conservatives. Like I said earlier, John Klein is the Republican representative of District 2 in Minnesota. Eric Paulson and Michelle Bachmann are the other two conservative-minded representatives at the U.S. level that represent Districts 3 and 6, respectively, here in Minnesota. And again, these are usually Republicans. Reactionaries are those that fall on the far right-hand side of the spectrum, and like radicals, they will use extreme strategies and techniques to get their way, sometimes violence. They tend to go back to the way things used to be. They like to go back to where mom stayed at home and took care of the kids and took care of all the domestic duties, and dad went out and was the breadwinner of the family. So they really want to bring it back to the way things used to be. In very extreme cases, these can take the form of militias, Aryan Nation groups, KKKs, sometimes terrorists as well, but that's on the very extreme right-hand side. So this kind of rounds out the political spectrum. We'll go into more depth with the political grid, which breaks this down a little bit further into social and economic issues. This does not do a very good job, and what you should remember about this particular spectrum is that there's a lot of vagueness in here, there's a lot of overlap, it's very broad, therefore it's really hard for somebody just to say, well, I'm a liberal. They might be a liberal on certain social issues and certain economic issues, but they might be conservative on others, so that's why we would see most people lying somewhere in between here, close to the moderate or centrist range. And lastly, when talking about sources for your political philosophy paper, which we'll talk about later, liberals, if you're more of a liberal, you tend to maybe watch more of the MSNBC cable news channel. You might take readings out of the Huffington Post, which is more of a liberal paper. So is the New York Times. Whereas if you were a Republican, you may watch Fox News. You might get your daily reading from the Wall Street Journal or the National Review, which are also more conservative-minded news sources.